Hello and welcome to another edition of Two Guys and a Chainsaw. I'm Todd.
And I'm Craig.
And today we have a very special guest with us, all the way from California. Say hello to the people, Simone.
Hello. Yes, I flew all the way from California to China just to record this podcast with you guys. I'm very, very excited today.
Yeah, Simone's been a listener of our podcast. I'll just say she's a coworker of mine. She's totally into horror. And so she was like, hey, could I guest on your podcast? And I said, yeah, you passed the test. I've watched some movies with her. She's pretty sharp. This is going to be
sweet. I'm really excited.
This is going to be good.
I'm really, really excited. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. And in fact, Simone picked the movie for today, which was Final Destination.
Yes, this was a movie I saw, came out in the year 2000. And I'm totally going to date myself here. But I was 10 years old when I first saw this in the theater. I'm just really excited to talk about it. It's one of my favorite films.
What was it? So you saw it in the theater. I think I saw it in the theater too. Craig, did you see it in the theater?
I think so.
All right. So Simone, as a 10-year-old watching this movie, would be a little different from, I think we were in college, right, Craig? Or we just graduated from college.
We were in college for sure.
That's right. No problem, though, Simone. Don't worry about it. Because that's an interesting perspective we wouldn't normally get. This is a movie that for the two of us, I think, for Craig and I, this movie comes on the heels of a lot of movies like it. Which were markedly different from the films the previous decade. I mean, we're children of the 80s, and you know what those 80s horror movies are like. Mm-hmm. And then Scream came out, and after that, like, all of the movies from the 90s just took this very distinct direction in the look and the feel and the subject matter and where they were located and the basically, like, really well-off white people, like the cast of Friends, has bad things happen to them.
Yes, exactly.
But so, I mean, we saw the change, but you pretty much grew up with that, I think, as your horror, or am I wrong? Am I assuming too much?
No. You're absolutely correct. My kind of start in the horror genre, The Shining was the first scary movie I ever saw. But my parents also wanted to make sure that I started off with the classics. So The Shining, Twilight Zone, those kinds of old vintage shows. But I did see a lot of the 80s slasher films growing up at a very young age. My mom and I would walk to Blockbuster and like pick out, the next sequence and events of the Friday the 13th or the Nightmare on Elm Streets and things like that. But yes, I remember seeing Scream before Final Destination, of course. And that's when I really started thinking, well, anyone could be a serial killer. Like I even started thinking, like, can my dad be a serial killer?
Is he, by the way?
No.
Not that you know of yet.
Not that I know of yet.
All right. So what was your take on Final Destination then as a 10-year-old? How did you come out of that?
What I liked so much about Final Destination, and I remember even thinking about this as a 10-year-old, was that it was the first scary movie I saw where really there was no apparent crazy masked murderer. There was no Freddy Krueger. There was no Jason. This was freak accidents. And I became really, really kind of enamored and fascinated by the idea of like, oh my God, we really can die at any time. And so at 10, kind of had this existential crisis of like, well, I could get hit by a bus at any moment too.
Oh my gosh.
I remember leaving the movie that day, not only just even more in love with Devon Sawa and Kara Smith, of course, but heavily just really enjoyed the way in which these characters got their demise.
It is different in that the protagonist is not seen, or the antagonist is not seen, right? You don't have the masked killer running around. It's death. Death is the antagonist.
Yeah, and that's why, I guess we're getting a little bit, or I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. But that's why I think that the series works so well, because you can really set one of these movies in any time, in any place, and it will work because death is a constant. So I don't even remember how many of these movies there were, like 7 or something like that. But I think that this is a franchise that could continue indefinitely because the options are just limitless.
How many were there, Simone? Simone knows because she's seen them all.
I have seen them all, and in the theater, guilty as charged. And that's one of the reasons I think why this first one is so great is because it got me so excited for 2 and 3. I believe there are 5 in total, the 5 being called The Final Destination. And upon doing a little bit more research, I think there's a 6th one in the making.
Really?
Yes.
Well, and I thought they have all been, to varying degrees, they've all been pretty successful. There were some that I liked better than others. The last one I thought was really good. So yeah, I'm glad that there's another one in development because they're creative. And part of the fun, it's not entirely dissimilar from the Saw franchise, when part of the fun is just seeing these new creative ways that death can take people, and it's creative and entertaining.
Yeah, it really does become a puzzle of sorts. And I think, watching it, this was only the second time I'd seen it. I remembered seeing it in the theater. I had not seen it again. I haven't seen any of the sequels. And I remembered enjoying it. But I think the second time around, I enjoyed it even more because once you get the hook, once you see what the movie's about, and the movie basically is about a kid who is in high school, who looks like a college-age kid, like all of his friends and everybody in these movies. But he is, it focuses on him, and his name is Alex, and he's getting ready for a senior class trip to Paris. And the whole class is going. There's a jerk guy named Carter. There's a Stifler character named Billy, who's played by the guy.
Stifler.
By Stifler. Yeah. There's the weird girl Claire, who is the girl who is just a little odder than everybody else, kind of keeps to herself. And anyway, we meet all these characters later, but it really starts out with Alex at home with his parents, and he's getting ready to go on the trip. And there are all these little tiny premonitions that are happening. The clock flashes at 1 o'clock a.m., but then the little line on the digital readout on the clock between the middle 0 has an 8, and 180 is actually their flight. And so there's that he doesn't even see, but then there are just little things here and there. He doesn't want to clip the tags off of his luggage because he feels like it's bad luck from his previous trip, and his mom says, "Oh, don't do that," and he cuts it. Even his dad comes in, right, and says like this.
So, 17, on the loose, senior trip with your friends in Paris, 10 days in the springtime. Live it up, Alex. You got your whole life ahead of you.
Of course, they make no bones about it being an ominous kind of tone, and they zoom in on his eyes. It's really kind of goofy. But you appreciate these things, I think, even more so on the second viewing, because you're on the lookout for them anyway, but now that you kind of know what's going to happen, you're looking for even more things that might be hidden, or more premonitions you might have missed, or little coincidences that happen. And that's really the whole movie is based on this. He goes to the airport, and they get on the plane, and amidst all these premonitions, he just feels uneasy about this whole thing. All these things happen to him, and he falls asleep on the plane and has a nightmare, basically, about a premonition, about the plane going up in flames. And when he wakes up, all those things that he dreamed about start happening, up to the point where he freaks out and says, "I want off this plane." And he ends up dragging 3 or 4 other people off with him. It's Carter, that jerk guy, and his girlfriend. It's the Billy character. It's his friend. What was his friend's name? Todd. His friend Todd. Yeah, I should know that. His friend Todd gets off the plane with them to see if he's okay. And then one of the 2 teachers who accompany them, Valerie, one of the 2 French teachers, goes off as well. And the authorities won't let any of them back on the plane. Valerie convinces them to maybe let her on. It's basically either going to have to be her or the other teacher who gets on, and the other one has to stay. So she ends up convincing him, "No, you just go on ahead." And what happens is the plane blows up just like he imagined it would, and that freaks everybody out. So he's got a couple agents who are very interested in why did you know that the plane was going to blow up, and they're a bit of a thorn in his side for a while, so there's a suspicion cast on him from that direction. But there's also, for example, we mentioned the Claire girl. She gets off the plane because she believes him. Mm-hmm. She thinks this is odd, and so she gets off, and so there's this other angle of the people who think that he's psychic and want to know what else he knows, and it becomes a really interesting situation that Alex gets put in as a result of having these premonitions. You'd think that he saved these people's lives, they'd be really happy, but that freaks them out even more. And then, of course, the fact that he had these premonitions keeps his mind open to more premonitions as it goes on, and that's really the core of the movie, is this idea that we can kind of predict our death in some way, because death leaves these clues or these little premonitions that if we're smart enough or observant enough, we'll pick up on them.
Right. These the opening sequence. I mean, after there's a little bit where his character is established, and we get, even in just the opening shots, these ominous things. Everything in the opening credits are these potentially dangerous threats. We see like a puppet hanging, a book falls over, and it's death of a salesman. It's really heavy-handed, but I think in an effective way. I mean, it really establishes a tone of you need to be watching out for these little details, these little clues, and that then. With the premonition, the accident scene, I don't know about you, Simone, but these opening sequences, these initial premonitions, really throughout the course of the series became what you were really looking forward to and anticipating, because in the first movie, with the plane crash, it plays out in real time. So unless you're going in with any foreknowledge, you're assuming that this is actually happening. And then when Alex, played by Devon Sawa, wakes up, you realize that it hasn't actually happened yet. The opening explosion of the plane, it's really scary and graphic, and it only lasts about 2 minutes. In all of the subsequent films, they really played up these first premonitions, and that was kind of the big exciting opening to every single one of the sequels. The premise remains constant throughout. That yes, death has a design, and if you are smart enough, capable enough, intuitive enough to figure out the design, then you can possibly thwart it. But that opening sequence, I mean, in the theater, watching that in a big group of people, and it's so intense, that is really maybe the most appealing part of the movie and the following movies for me.
Yeah, the accident scenes in all of the films, I think, I don't want to say have gotten better, but you're absolutely right. It's something that you're always looking forward to, like, oh, what's it going to be for this one? Uh-huh. And they have gotten longer and even more gorier, almost to the point where it's a little bit cheesy, especially the one, the accident happens in the racetrack. But what I liked so much about this one is that plane accidents, although they are rare, is like a huge legitimate fear for most people. Yeah. And I remember, kind of as an inside joke, every time my sister and I would get on a plane, we would always be sitting together. We would check the little knobs on the safety trays in front of you, and we're like, okay, I swear to God, if this one breaks, we're getting off the plane.
I think that's part of, with this one in particular, you're right. The rest of them get more outrageous, and arguably, that's fun to see them keep pushing the envelope. But this one, like you said, plays on such a common fear, and it plays out in exactly the way that you would expect a plane crash to play out, and that's what makes it, I think, so scary, with all the turbulence at first, and then the lights flashing and the oxygen masks dropping. That's, I don't know about I guess I can't speak for everybody, but for me, that's like my worst nightmare. That's worst case scenario anytime you sit down in an airplane seat. And so it works because it really plays on a fear that's common to anybody who has traveled by air.
Well, and I think it's funny that you bring that up too, Craig, because I was thinking the exact same thing. I was thinking, this is a place where they could have saved a lot of money. They didn't have to show us the entire plane wreck in such detail and make that scene what had to be a really expensive scene full of lots of effects. It really didn't need to happen because it's not like there's any information in that we see in that scene that helps us out later with the movie. It's not like that scene casts a dark shadow over the rest of the movie, I should say, because it's just a crash and a whole bunch of people we don't really know, end up blowing up and dying, and we've just met, a couple of them. Yet they chose to really draw that scene out and really make it horrible. And I think you're onto something there. It sets us up by playing to some of our most common and worst fears, showing us just how well-founded those fears can be, because this is how bad a plane crash really could be, that you're in it. And then, for everything subsequent to that, we are now confronting the scary things in our everyday life. And maybe they are as bad as we think. Maybe the fear of crossing the street and getting hit by a bus is every bit as real as it hits us inside on a gut level. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
No, I think it does. And like I said, when I first saw this, thinking like, I got to be careful because freak accidents like this can happen all the time. And we see kind of accidents like that happening in the news, or you see those shows like 1,000 Ways to Die or something. And my dad and I kind of coined the term a final destination moment when you see and hear about just these awful ways to go. It's like, oh, well, that's a final destination moment there, because it's almost like so outlandish, but could also be a very, very common way to go.
Right, and also maybe not at the hands of another human, right?
Right.
And that's the thing that sets all of these things apart as well in this film, is it's not like death is bringing a killer around the corner towards you. It's not like death is nudging these people down a dark alley where somebody's in waiting to hurt them. Death is it's freak accidents throughout this whole movie that seeing them on their own, you would just say, oh, this guy committed suicide, or oh, this woman slipped and fell, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other thing, if somebody who was really paranoid went into any of these movies, really, well, even myself, who just I just have some kind of mild anxiety. But if you're thinking about the premise of the movie, if you're looking for clues, or if you're looking for these kinds of clues that the main character sees here, you can see them all over the place. The movie plays it up very ominously with ominous music and scary stuff, but just before they board the plane, Alex is looking up at the boards in the airport, and he's focusing in on the words terminal and departed. And those things are there all the time. And all of I can imagine coming out of this movie and everywhere you go, seeing all of these little things that you're like, oh crap! I'm for sure gonna die in the next 5 minutes because of these little details all around. But they play it well. I mean, it's very paranoid, and I think the characters in the movie initially, when Alex is trying to explain what's going on, they think that he's just being paranoid. But in the context of the movie, in fact, it's just that he's very intuitive and observative, and he's catching these things that maybe the rest of us or the other characters wouldn't catch.
Yes. And I think that this first one plays so much on the idea of, well, is Alex crazy, or is he really intuitive and seeing these premonitions by seeing the signs, like the piece of shredded what was that, a Hustler magazine? What did he take out? And it says the word Todd, so he gets that feeling like, oh, something's wrong with Todd. This movie really, I think, sets that up, in which the other movies of the series don't necessarily spend too much time in thinking, oh, am I crazy or am I intuitive, because they'll kind of relate it back to the first one. So I really like that this movie sets up so much with like the FBI agents putting so much attention into Alex as to why he's always shows up at the scene of the crime or at the death scene.
Right.
Yeah. At some point, Alex, and I think this is kind of silly, but I see where it's just necessary for the movie. After the plane crash, Alex becomes obsessed with plane crashes. and like it pans through his room and he has books on planes and he has like articles from old plane crashes somewhere else and he's called things up on his computer. This is kind of pre-WWW in some ways. Not totally pre-WW, but definitely early days. But it's like, what is he hoping to discover by examining all these other plane crashes?
Yes. And I hate to bring this up, but I turned to Todd and I just said, well, pre-9/11 magic there, because anyone else who would go to the library and rent out thousands of books on plane crashes and start to research plane crashes would have a huge suspicion on them.
Yeah, I definitely thought the same thing.
The one thing that he ends up putting together, obviously, through all this research is nothing.
No. It wasn't until like the flight details of the explosion is when real kind of clues are given as to when like the order in which his friends were going to die. Yeah,
his first friend to die is
Todd.
And Todd has been very supportive of him. He's probably the one guy who's been next to him who is treating him pretty normally after this plane crash. But Todd ends up dying in a shower. Mm-hmm. And that the other interesting thing about this movie, and you guys are going to have to help me out, I bet it's just a hallmark of the series, are these crazy Rube Goldberg type ways that people die. There's a leak in the toilet and the water comes out and he unplugs this and then he slips on that, which then trips him up in the cord hanging from the shower, which he slides into the tub, which I don't remember, was there some gel or some shampoo there or something?
The shampoo falls and like the liquid that he slipped on was at the bottom of his feet, which made it slippery for him. But you turn to me and you're like, just curl your knees into your chest and like use your arms to hoist yourself up.
Use your arms, dude. Like, what was wrong with his arms? Why couldn't he lift himself up out of that tub?
Yeah.
Am I wrong about that? Craig, did you see something that we didn't see?
Oh, no. I have always thought the same thing. Todd is probably, and I feel like it must kind of just come from the performance of this little quirky actor. But he's kind of the most endearing character. You feel sorry for him because he lost his brother on the flight. And he's the only one that, well, aside from Clear, who is grateful, the rest of everybody else is either fearful of Alex or they kind of place some blame on him. But Todd is his friend that kind of stands by him. And Todd, they have this big memorial service for the teenagers that were lost and the one teacher that was lost. And Todd gets up and speaks about death.
We say that the hour of death cannot be forecast. But when we say this, we imagine that the hour is placed in an obscure and distant future. Never occurs to us that it has any connection with the day already begun, or that death could arrive this same afternoon. This afternoon which is so certain, and which has every hour filled in advance.
And then he's the first one to go, and it's kind of a gut punch. You're right in that the series totally plays up that whole sequence of events, unlikely sequence of events leading up to what appear to the outside world to be accidents. And with Todd's, and there it could come across as convoluted, but I think that the way that it's played, it comes across more as just, Death is a really tricky, it's a really tricky guy. Initially, this was the first death that was scripted. It was the first death that was shot. And, there's this whole sequence of events leading up to the fatal accident. But one of the things that you see is he's shaving in the mirror, and you see this dark shadow across the mirror, and he kind of notices it too. And that plays in later to some of the deaths, but less prominently. And I read that initially they had imagined the character of Death as being a more prominent actual figure or character in the movie. So you would see the shadow as though there were an actual entity there. And I guess after Todd's death, they decided to pull that back a little bit so that it was more conceptual. And in the, if I remember correctly, I've seen all the sequels too, but it's been a while. If I remember correctly, they really kind of pulled away from that and made it just more Death as a concept rather than an active figure. But yeah, he should have just curled his knees up under and stood up. But if I were slipping and sliding and hanging by some weird wire in the shower, I don't know how logical or rational I would be in that moment either. So it's sad to watch because it plays out over a good 30 seconds, and he's struggling, and his eyeballs are bulging and bloodshot, and eventually he just succumbs. But I don't know. I thought it's a really tense and suspenseful scene, and I think that tension holds throughout. It's a very suspenseful movie. You're always wondering what's going to happen next.
Now, Simone, you made a comment during the scene that you felt like that Death was cheating a little bit.
Yes, but kind of, and I'll talk about why. But I after giving some thought into it, I kind of saw why they made this choice. And this is once Todd finally dies, you see the water from the toilet that was leaking suck back in. And it almost made it seem like instead of it being a freak accident, obviously they played it that way to make it seem like Todd's death was a suicide. Even though when they go to the morgue later, the Mortician, who ends up being a very vital character in the rest of the series, points out, he has scratch marks around his neck, like he was pulling at this wire. I always thought that it was kind of cheap that they did that Death can snap its fingers and make magic appear,
cover up his tracks in a way, in a supernatural way.
Exactly. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is the only death that's kind of ruled by suicide in all of the series. And I think the reason why they kind of went for that choice as Todd's death by suicide is, it sets up that, no, this wasn't an accident. He felt so much grief about his brother surviving, his brother passing and staying on the plane, and him surviving, that he took his own life, which kind of puts more emphasis on Alex's premonitions being as off-putting, and why he happened to be there at the same moment or at his house when the ambulance was taking the body out of the house.
Yeah, it gives we've had the grief, we've had the people who are suspicious of Alex. But now we also have the person who just thinks he's caused more problems. He's actually caused problems for example, this suicide. It's really crazy how they pile all that on him.
Yeah.
And his psyche. And it's no wonder, it's really a good choice, actually. It's no wonder that he does, by one scene in the movie where he's holding himself up in a cabin, which comes later, he does seem crazy.
He does.
He's really going off the deep end there.
Well, and at this point, he suspects that there's something weird going on, but he doesn't have any idea what it is. And he goes because he has this, it's not really a premonition, but it's like clues. the premise is kind of that if you watch, there are clues. And you had already mentioned that he like pulled out, like a nudie magazine and had thrown it at a fly or a moth or something, and a page got sucked through the fan, and it, the shred that he sees is Todd. So he knows, or he suspects that something's going on with Todd. And so when, after Todd has died, he shows up there and, is shocked to find what has happened and is sad because it's his friend. But of course that just casts more suspicion on him from these FBI agents, who are also there. But he also sees that Clear is there. So he, after this, goes and visits with her, and she says that while they were on the plane, the reason that she got off after his freak out was because she didn't have a premonition, but she had a bad feeling too, and she trusted him. So for whatever reason, they decide to go break into the mortuary to check out Todd's body and see if they can figure out anything from that. And this scene, I think, is really kind of one of the iconic scenes from the movie, because they break in and they find Todd's body, and it jerks. Todd's arm jerks. But then in comes the Mortician, played by Tony Todd, who is just, an icon of horror in himself. He's the Candyman. He's been in a million horror movies. And the impression that I have and have always had, because this character recurs in most, not all, but most of the sequels, is that really this is kind of the personification of death. And he has this excellent monologue.
In death, there are no accidents, no coincidences, no mishaps, and no escapes. What you have to realize is that we're all just a mouse that a cat has by the tail. Every single move we make, from the mundane to the monumental, the red light that we stop at or run, the people we have sex with or won't with us, the airplanes that we ride or walk out of. It's all part of death's sadistic design, leading to the grave.
Design? Does that mean if you figure out the design, you can cheat death?
Alex, you've already done that by walking off the plane. Your friend's departure shows that death has a new design for all of you. Now you have to figure out how and when it's coming back at you. Play your hunch, Alex, if you think you can get away with it. But remember, the risk of cheating the plan, of disrespecting the design, could incite a fury that could terrorize even the Grim Reaper.
And that's when Alex really kind of figures out what's going on. And that's when he starts putting together the pieces of, okay, if I have to figure out what the original design was so that I can figure out what the new design may be. And that's really the premise that he works on from that point on. And the next scene after the Mortician scene is when all of the remaining survivors from the crash inadvertently convene on this street corner where Alex has been trying to tell Clear, this is what's happening. Death has a design, and she's not buying into it. But they all end up on this street corner, and the puzzle pieces just continue to lay themselves out.
And that's goofy, but then I guess you can read it another way. I mean, when I was watching this, I was thinking, okay, so they all happen to be converging in the cafe at the same time. But then I guess you kind of wonder, is this part of Death's design? Is he toying with them in this way? Which raises, I think, an interesting question, period. And that is he toying with them? Is Alex special in some way? Is he, for some reason, choosing to give Alex premonitions that he's not giving anyone else? Or are we all going to be getting these premonitions? We're just not smart enough or intuitive enough to pick up on them. I mean, why Alex, down the street and across town is going to get a little shard of paper falling in his lap that says Todd? Why wouldn't Todd just die? Why wouldn't Todd, death just make Todd die? Maybe Todd himself would see premonitions as he did in the mirror, but why would Alex see premonitions of another person's death? You know what I mean?
Aside from the initial premonition, which always happens in all of the sequels, one person gets this premonition. Aside from that, I think that what they're suggesting is that the clues are always there. They're always around. It's just that we are not receptive to them in most cases. And for whatever reason, these certain individuals, I don't know why they are given these premonitions, but we all... And they usually don't amount to anything, but we all have bad feelings about things sometimes. And I think that we all imagine worst case scenarios sometimes. So maybe that's what the whole premonition deal is. But I actually like that suggestion that it's not a matter of, one person is being given these clues. It's that the clues are always there. We're just not always open and receptive to them. And I think that's a scary thought, if you're willing to suspend your disbelief and think that that's actually a possibility, then you're going to become a paranoid schizophrenic.
Yeah.
Well, and the clues veer into the supernatural as well, which I don't know, actually I felt was maybe a little weak. Death seems to come in reflections more often than anything else.
Yes. Like at that moment where all of the characters meet up again, Alex looks into the reflection mirror of the cafe that they're sitting, and he sees a bus go by. But when the camera pans out to the other side, there is no bus. And that's where the next character, Terry, gets her
oh my gosh
upcoming, which was, I think, my favorite death when I saw it for the first time, because it was just wham out of nowhere. Like, you can just drop dead, boom, and
she does.
Yes. And we loved that. I mean, like, I watched so many horror movies growing up, and I think my parents were never as concerned with like the gore and the blood as they were with like the sex and the cursing. So I think my mom might have whinged at all of the F-bombs in that movie.
Yeah.
Less than like, this girl just got hit by a bus and like blood splatters everywhere.
But isn't that the scene though? I don't know about you guys, but that's the scene I remembered. I mean,
yes.
you mentioned this movie. That's the one scene that comes to mind right off the bat. It's so shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's shocking in a really effective way, and almost, as a horror fan, you feel bad for that character. She doesn't have much character, frankly. She's kind of the popular ditzy girl who's just Carter's girlfriend, and that's really the only role that she plays. But in this one moment where she kind of stands up and says, "I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm not going to allow this to control my life," and then she just steps right off the curb, and this bus just comes out of nowhere, and it's so fast. As a horror fan, as badly as you feel for this girl, it almost brings a smile to your face, just because it was it's so quick and unexpected, and I love that scene.
It does come out of the blue.
Yeah.
But there is a point in which the premonition, it wasn't like a piece of paper flitting into a fan and it got cut up and a chunk happened to land on your lap, or this was very definitely supernatural. Mm-hmm. There's a reflection in the mirror that shouldn't be there. Do you think this is just this character who can see it, or that anybody who is looking at that window at that moment would have been able to see it?
I don't know. I guess since nobody else ever does, and since it's not a natural phenomenon, I guess maybe there is something special about Alex. I don't know for sure.
But to play on that a little bit at the end, this is skipping ahead a little bit, but at the end scene, when they do go to Paris 6 months later, which to me seems a little soon after all of this tragedy to go through, maybe 6 months later. I could see 6 years later, but they're finally in Paris. They're toasting to life, and all of a sudden Alex starts to feel weird, and he starts to kind of get this feeling like, well, okay, maybe we didn't cheat death, maybe it's going to happen. Claire gets this vision. She sees the bus out of a window and yells, "Alex!" And he kind of jumps back away from the bus, which skips Alex and then goes to Carter.
Yeah.
That's right. I'd forgotten about that. So maybe not. I don't know. The plot, it's tense and it's well paced. I think it doesn't really ever get boring. But I don't know about you guys, but I just kind of, it's not like I was impatient for it, but what you're waiting for is the next death. Alex figures out that he sees on the news that they suspect that this explosion on the plane was caused by a systems failure, and the explosion followed, I think, like a fuel line or something along those lines. So they track on the screen where the various explosions on the plane happen. And he is able to overlay the seating plan onto that. And so he can see who would have been next each time. And so he figures out after Terry dies that Miss Lewton is going to be next. And so he goes to her house and is kind of watching, which she sees, and she's already scared of him. He tried to approach her at the memorial, and she said, "Stay away from me. You scare me to death," or something like that.
You scare the hell out of me. Yeah.
Right. Which, yeah, good job, teacher. That's really sympathetic.
So supportive.
Right. But so then, each time we're just waiting. We know somebody else is going to get it, and we're just waiting to see how it's going to play out. Because we've seen how elaborately these things play out, and Miss Lewton's death is totally in keeping with that.
Super convoluted, it's again a total Rube Goldberg thing, and part of the pleasure of this movie, I guess, is seeing this play out and seeing the setup for it, right? It's like, again, like the pleasure of the Friday the 13th movie is seeing the creative way a person's going to die. This is that, but in sort of a puzzle way, right?
Yeah. And again, it kind of all starts with, we have two kind of big premonitions here. The first one, she starts playing the John Denver record, which of course, John Denver died in a plane crash. Each movie kind of has its own unique theme song to it. This one, I think, just John Denver as a musical artist is kind of a big premonition. And then the other one, Todd, you pointed out that I've never noticed, and I've seen this movie a ton of times, was her stained glass window with a knife.
Oh, the dagger in the behind her.
Yes, the dagger. Yes, and you were like, "Oh, there's the dagger," and I was like, "I'll be god darn, I never noticed that before."
Yeah, just looking for those things in the background. Watching it the second time, I was just eagle-eyed for those things. I think that must be part of the charm. I hope the subsequent movies hide a lot of things like that in it as well. Yeah,
I think a little bit.
With her death, like you said, it's so convoluted, but it's not entirely impossible. And, I guess that any accident, comes from a series of events, and you could never imagine that something like this could happen. So she makes some tea, and she pours hot tea into her mug. And then she notices that the name of the high school is on the mug, and that freaks her out because she's still traumatized by this. So she tosses out the tea, and instead of tea, she gets vodka out of the freezer, and she puts ice and the vodka in the glass, which probably would shatter the glass, that intense change from hot to cold, and it just cracks. So her vodka's leaking out as she's walking around, and she leans over her computer monitor for some reason, and the vodka drips in there, which causes an electrical fire, and the computer explodes, and she gets a shard of glass in her neck, and then she slips in the blood and falls down on her back in the kitchen, and she reaches up to try to grab a kitchen towel, but the towel's draped over the block of knives, and she pulls it down, and the knife falls into her chest. That would never happen, or at least you wouldn't expect it to happen, but it's not entirely out of the realm of possibilities. The rest of the series, it continues in that fashion. These deaths all seem so unlikely, but not impossible. And that's what I think makes it, kind of scary. It's plausibly could happen. You would never expect it to happen, but when do you ever expect an accident? If you expected an accident, then the accident probably wouldn't happen. So I like that.
Yeah, it's cool. Although I have to say, however I die, whatever form it takes, I absolutely do not want it in any way, shape, or form to involve me slipping in my own blood. That's all I've got to say. But yeah, another one of those weird coincidences that makes me wonder if Death isn't also orchestrating their meetups is that Billy happens to be riding by on his bike at exactly that moment when Alex runs out of Valerie's house, unable to save her, and the house explodes.
Well, right. And he's, again, in these extreme circumstances, you're really not thinking very well. But the police found him outside her house before any of this all happened. So because she called them. So they're already suspicious of him, but they released him because they didn't have anything to hold him on. And he went immediately back, which the timing doesn't match up at all. There's no way that they would have had time to take him somewhere, interrogate him, and then for him to get back before all this happened, because it seems to be only minutes. Rocky Mountain High is playing the whole time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But he gets back and he goes in to, I guess, try to save her, but she's already gone, really.
Yeah.
But he's tracking her blood through the house with his shoes. He pulls the knife out of her and doesn't even realize until after he's done so that obviously his fingerprints are now going to be on the knife. So after this, and the Sean William Scott character sees him coming out. So everything would point to him. And so he's on the run now, basically. He goes to Clear, and then Clear pulls the other two guys, Billy and Carter, together so that they can talk this out, because now she finally believes him. And so then again, they're all together. They're driving around. And Carter, who has been this kind of jerk character throughout, decides that he is not going to allow some other force to determine his fate.
You get off having control over me. You let me decide how to deal with it.
It doesn't matter who's next. Because we're all on the same list, all of us.
All right, then why bother? I mean, what's the f***ing point, right? Me and Terry, we'll be back together on the other side. So why wait any longer?
Carter, what are you doing?
And so he goes on this big reckless driving spree, and everybody else is freaking out. But eventually they stop on a train track, and Alex has explained to them what's going on, that it's next, and Carter believes it's going to be him. And Alex doesn't refute that. He doesn't affirm it either, but he doesn't refute it. And so they stop on these train tracks, and a train is coming. The rest of the characters get out, but Carter is just kind of sitting there like, I'm going to do this on my own terms. At the last minute, he decides, that he wants to get out, but he can't. The seatbelt sticks. He can't get out. And Alex goes to help pull him out, and the train is right there. But he pulls him out at the very last minute. And so they think that they have once again cheated death. But the Billy character, Sean William Scott, is standing there right next to the train tracks, and we see this piece of shrapnel from the car had been hit, and we see this piece of shrapnel rattling underneath the train. And as Billy's standing there saying, "You're next, Carter, you're next. It's going to be you. You're dead. You're dead." This piece of shrapnel shoots out from under the train and chops the whole top part of his head off. But this is kind of when Alex puts together that if you are able to change Death's design, then the design changes and it just moves on to the next person. So you can cheat it, but it's going to move on to the next person. And what was kind of funny to me, they don't even realize this until the very last scene that Simone already referenced when they're in Paris. What they don't put together is, yeah, you can cheat it and you can move it on to the next person, but once it's cycled through the rest of the people, it's going to loop back around. But they don't put that back together until the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Craig bringing back up that point where Carter says, "Oh, I'm going to I control my life, I control my death," and then kind of plays that cool guy like, "It just ain't my time," and then turns the keys to his engine like he's going to go suavely drive off past the train tracks, even though the guardrail's already down. all of a sudden death kind of works in this like magical kind of paranormal way where like the locks all of a sudden go down and he can't jiggle the door open, and the engine won't start, and all of a sudden his seatbelt is glued together. He can't unbuckle it. But Alex had this kind of premonition in the car earlier. He saw the seatbelt rip, which he kind of explained later, like, I saw the seatbelt rip, which is why I knew I was able to save Carter. So here death kind of works like, Carter, I'm gonna kill you because you're still sitting in this car, but then is cheated once more because Alex saw this premonition of the seatbelt tearing,
which is interesting. Like, so death gave him a clue, like, hey, here's how you could get him out, possibly. Like, to me, that doesn't quite jive, right, with the whole premonition thing. I don't know, like. That was a weird moment for me. Like, why did death clue him into how he could get Carter out of it?
It's almost like death is setting up exposition, like to kind of move the plot along, and that's why they were able to bring up the idea, which Craig you brought up earlier. That's when they really discovered, like, okay, if it skips one person, then it just immediately goes on to the next. Like
death wants them to know, like wants them to discover this or something. Like he's really playing with them or something.
Sly hint there, death. I see what you did.
Well, it's ambiguous, and I don't remember, like I said, it's been so long since I've seen the sequels, but it's ambiguous. Is it death providing the clues? Because that doesn't really make much sense. Why would, if we're considering death as an entity, why would it give clues? It doesn't really make any sense. Is it something else? Is there some other force that's maybe working against death or giving these characters a chance, and it's just ambiguous. I don't think that it's ever expanded upon, but it's clever, and it makes for a nice suspenseful story.
Yeah, all I know is that if I would not be getting in the same car or be anywhere near the other three people who are marked for death if I was also marked for death.
Yes.
That was a bad mistake. That was a big mistake from the beginning.
Yeah, you turned to me because we watched the movie together. Why are they all together?
You are an easy target here, guys.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and that's the other thing too. If death was trying to take them all out, why wouldn't it just lock them all in the car? Just get them all with one fell swoop. Like it's very specific. No, I need to have this one first and then move on. After all this happens, Alex realizes that because Carter has been saved and Billy is gone, Alex realizes that he is next. So he goes Clear, takes him out to her dad's cabin somewhere, and he foolproofs this cabin against death. We see him setting up all these safeties around the cabin, and that scene, if any scene, I felt like was something that they felt like they had to get in there, and it seemed kind of rushed. Because it all happens so quickly. You see him safeguarding the house, and then immediately you see a sequence of things start. But he notices it too, and he's able to stop it. And so he realizes then that he has, thwarted his own death. And so Clear is next, and so he has to try to get to her, and we see her immediately start to get into peril when there's a thunderstorm and lightning. I don't remember if it strikes a tree or if it strikes the telephone pole, but a wire goes down. And then, of course, as is always the case, there's just a whole sequence of things where her life is at risk now, too.
Yeah, she ends up trapped in a car by the end of it when when Alex finally arrives. And there's a live wire dancing on the top of her car. And he's like, no, stay in there because you're grounded by the tires. I think what he meant was you're insulated by the tires, but that's okay. Because you don't want to be grounded or electricity will pass through you. But anyway, you're grounded by the tires. And then somebody needs to teach this kid how to deal with a live wire situation. I mean, you've got all these down trees and branches and things around you. Yeah. You don't just run up to the wire, grab a hold of it to get it off.
He tries to hit it with a shovel a few times.
Yeah, it's kind of a half-assed half-assed attempt at knocking it off with something else before he decides that he's going to sacrifice his life because obviously if he dies next, then it's going to have skipped her.
Yes. And that sequence is almost comical in that way where he's like, you're safe by the tires, don't worry. And then gasoline leaks under the car and the live wire spark starts a fire underneath the car. And then your car's going to explode. So you're not safe anymore. And that's when he decides to take on the wire and save her.
And he grabs the wire and he gets thrown, but he's successful in getting it off the car. And I guess since he's apparently dead, Death is like, okay, well, there was that attempt, so the wire goes dead. And I thought, I didn't remember, I've seen this movie so many times too, but I didn't remember this one moment where, Alex is on the ground, Clear gets down next to him, she sees that his hands are all burnt up, he's clearly been electrocuted, and then it totally fades to white. And when it fades out of the white, it fades into the corridor, that extending corridor between the terminal and the airplane. And I was kind of thinking, like, is this like the white light? Is the passage to the afterlife one of these airplane hallways?
Yeah. Well, they were talking about that one of the scenes on the beach. That Alex and Clear have this conversation about, like, do you think they're still up there in the sky somewhere? All of our friends up on the plane. So I think perhaps that might have been a little nod to that conversation they had earlier.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, it's a good catch.
The way I saw that scene was as it was coming out of white, I did feel like, Craig, like you said, like it was the white light and we were going down this passage. But then as it faded in, I thought it looked like a hospital corridor, like he's being pushed down a gurney. And then as it fades in even more, because, you hear the voices, and that's such a typical shot, in movies of the slowly fading into the hospital gurney thing. But then you're right, it becomes this airplane hallway. And I don't know if that was intentional for you to kind of get that double or triple take, but that's what happened to me anyway. And I thought it was a great shot.
Yeah, I liked it a lot. And then it's a nice surprise when you see that the remaining survivors, Clear and Carter, are on a plane. And it says 6 months later. And at first, you think it's going to be just the two of them. And they talk about how they're finally, we're finally here. We're finally in Paris after all this time. And then Alex walks into the shot. So you realize that how somehow he was saved. They got him to a hospital, or they did CPR. Somehow he's back, and the three of them, I guess, to kind of celebrate that they've gotten through this ordeal, have decided to go to Paris together. And we see them at this little very typically Parisian outside cafe where they've all got drinks, and they're just kind of reminiscing about, we all got through this, maybe we were meant to. And Carter, who has been such a jerk throughout the whole thing, is like,
if you would have told me 6 months ago that the three of us would be sitting here having a drink. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, sometimes it just feels like the two of you are the only ones who can really understand.
And this is when Alex starts telling them that he's been thinking about it a lot, and he's worried that he may have overlooked something. And he pulls out, that diagram that he had before about the order. And, they don't want to hear it. It's 6 months later, it's over. They don't want to keep rehashing it. But he insists. And it's only in this moment, 6 months later, that he realizes or remembers, oh, wait a minute. In my premonition, I had already switched seats with somebody, but in real life, I never switched the seats. So we had the order wrong. And then he starts, again, seeing all these clues. And again, you wonder, is he just being paranoid? It's 6 months later. You would think that 6 months later, something would have happened by now. And I actually kind of think that's a little bit of a flaw in the storytelling. Like, why all of a sudden is Death now waiting 6 months to,
Yes.
when everything else had happened in a matter of like 2 days. But then we, it makes for a fun and exciting final scene.
Yes, and I think that the series always, or at least some of the movies in the series, kind of has that kind of ending gag scene where someone just gets completely reamed. But Todd, you brought this up earlier when we were watching the movie, in that you're like, well, how do you know when death is going to strike? I mean, could it be tomorrow? Could it be 10 minutes from now? Could it be 10 years from now? Which I think is kind of a really interesting point, that you're right, that these freak accidents all of a sudden start happening one after another very shortly after the plane crash. But now all of a sudden death just is okay with like waiting patiently for them to go back to Paris, where it all might kind of began.
Yeah.
Right.
So the idea behind these movies is pretty much like the first one then? There's some accident that some people get out of that they shouldn't have gotten out of, and that kind of marks them? Is that kind of how it is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Everyone. Yeah. And in this one, so Alex figures all this out, and he gets up to try to go away and tells the other people to stay away from him. And again, we see this sequence of things happening where there's a car accident, which causes like some kind of construction accident that sends this bar flying and breaks this enormous lighted sign, and it starts to swing down into the street where Alex is standing, and you think it's going to hit him, and he knows that he's supposed to be next, but at the very last second, Carter jumps in and moves him out of the way. And Carter, I think, says, or no, Alex says, yeah, you did it. You saved me. And Carter says, well, if I saved you, then who's next? And we see behind him this the sign swinging back. And I read somewhere that, it was like a 180, it swung one way and then it did a 180, which is the flight number, and comes back, and we don't even see the impact. It cuts to black right before the impact, but we hear it. And I thought that was, sad for Carter, I guess, but a nice ending, a fun ending.
Yes.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's a fun ending to a fun movie. And I guess I've forgotten how fun the movie was. Somewhere in my mind, it got jumbled in with I Know What You Did Last Summer and the other Scream movies. And it really follows that 90s horror movie trope of being really clever and being really high concept and having lots of really good-looking white teenagers in their suburban neighborhoods, But honestly, it's a little better than that. And now that you have compared it to the Saw franchise in a way that you'd watch it subsequent ones just to kind of unpack the puzzles, I can totally get into this. I think I'm going to watch the others.
I think we should do a movie marathon of the other ones, because they really are fantastic. And just like I remember going to go see the other Saw films of what's going to be the next elaborate trap? What's Jigsaw's plot this time? You totally just go to see how these people are going to bite the dust. You want to see these, what freak accidents are they going to come up to next? And they really are fun.
Well, that's what I was, with the subsequent ones. The second one is and they all kind of tie to the first one. The second one, the character of Clear comes back. She's the only recurring character that I remember, and they make reference to the first one throughout. But really, the movies don't have to be connected. And that's what I like about the series, is that it's really just kind of an anthology series. You get different characters and different circumstances in every one. And that's why I'm glad to hear that there may be another one in production. And I hope that they continue to make them. You could set one way in the past. You could set one in the future. It can be contemporary. It doesn't make any difference, because the concept works regardless of place or time. And I think that, whoever came up with this idea, which originally I read that this was it began as a concept for an episode of the X-Files, and just developed into its own thing. But it's so smart. Whoever came up with it was so smart, because it's limitless what you could do with it.
Oh, that's so true. Now, what happened to the character? What happened to the actors in this movie? I mean, Alex, what was his name?
Devon Sawa.
Well, have I seen him and I just don't realize? Did he do much after this?
Yeah, actually, in the opening scene, where Alex is in his room, there's a movie poster behind him, and I forget the name of the movie poster, but it's actually another movie that he was in that I think that they were kind of advertising and pushing for the time. But Devon Sawa, and this is just because I loved him so much. He was Casper in the 90s movie Casper with Christina Ricci. He was in a movie Wild America with another 90s love of mine, Jonathan Taylor Thomas. But he was also in another horror movie called Idle Hands, which is kind of a campy horror film, also starring Seth Green. And it's phenomenal. His hand is like possessed by the devil. And
it's hilarious.
Yeah, he murders people, or his hand rather murders people. So I don't think these actors, besides Sean William Scott, really kind of playing on that Stifler role in probably every film he's ever done. I haven't seen too much of.
Well, Ali Larter, who played Clear, she's done a lot. She was in Heroes, and she's still working. This was one of her early movies. Another one of her early movies was Drive Me Crazy with Melissa Joan Hart. And, she kind of, earlier in her career, she always kind of played the tough girl. And I guess even later in her career. But she, as she developed out of her, early 20s into adulthood, she became really kind of this bombshell, sexy lady. And she's, I still see her popping up in things from time to time. And but you're right, I don't think a lot of them, aside from Sean William Scott, who it seems like his star is kind of fading now a little bit too, they didn't go on to do a whole lot, but I thought that it was a good cast. It was a nice ensemble cast. Yeah, they played to stereotypes quite a bit, but you get invested in the characters, and it's a fun ride overall.
It really is, and I gained a lot more appreciation for it the second time around. All right, well, thank you again for listening to another episode. If you like this episode, please share it with a friend. We're on iTunes and Stitcher, and we also have social media accounts. We're on Facebook and Twitter. If you like what you heard, please drop us a comment there. Let us know a movie we should see, and we're always looking for suggestions. Until that next time, I'm Todd.
I'm Craig.
And I'm Simone. Thank you for having me.
With two guys, a gal, and a chainsaw.